Just like any other convention of writing, power systems have themselves undergone many forms and evolutions throughout the years. Through continued use of such systems, the mechanics, tropes, and characteristics of them change and morph to suit both the individual authors and the ideas and demands of the time. For example, in many older series, power systems of the more supernatural persuasion were mostly exclusive to aliens, mystical beings, and cyborgs. This, however, changed when series like Fist of the North Star and Dragon Ball began introducing the concept of Ki, a spiritual power possessed by all living things that could be harnessed through rigorous training. This meant that now, regular humans could compete in the Shonen and Seinen rings and be part of colossal, supernatural struggles. And this was an important step, as the fantasies and stories that era wanted to sell were more intensely focused on the appeal of martial arts-based powers wielded by humans, as introduced by Dragon Ball. However, this would not remain the last change to this convention. While now the spectrum of who could have powers and who couldn't had been broadened, it was still somewhat limiting. Any given character that wanted to use Ki, or any derivative of it, needed to be a martial artist, someone intensely devoted to the art of combat. And while that is an interesting approach that has been used fantastically in past series, it still put a hard ceiling on the type of stories that you could tell under these conditions for a power system. So the next step seems clear, at least in hindsight. Just as Dragon Ball had loosened the shackles on the cyborg-dominated powers of the early 80s, another series would and should come along and free up the system even more. And that is exactly what happened on April 3rd, 1989, with the release of chapter 114 of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, and the introduction of stands. Spoilers for Jojo if you couldn't guess! Introduced quite late into the life of the Jojo's Bizarre Adventure manga, at the beginning of its third part Stardust Crusaders, these powers were no longer reliant on the intense training of the mind, but could rather occur and develop in any one living being, regardless of physical or mental strength. This essentially shattered all limits power systems could have had, and in turn changed the formula of them forever. I don't think I need to tell you just how insanely influential Jojo is. So as you can imagine, this exciting change rippled throughout the manga landscape and is still felt today, with many modern series still taking inspirations from it, especially in regards to the power system. Name any shonen of the last decade and I can all but assure you it is at least aware of Jojo's existence. So, for the second installment of our Power System series, I think it's time to look at stands and see why it's such a beloved and important system. Now before we get into the good and the bad like last time, I think we should quickly summarize what stands actually are and how they work. Stands are a manifestation of the user's life force and psychological energy. They appear in all shapes and sizes, with the most commonly known one being the buff punching ghost, standing behind the user, hence the name stand. While they have many different abilities, weaknesses and mechanics, and are therefore difficult to talk about as a whole, there are some aspects they almost all share. They usually have no personality of their own and are merely extensions of the user, obeying them completely. They can only be hurt by other stands, however, they themselves can harm humans and other stand users. Any damage the stand takes is transferred to the user and vice versa. Hence, if one of them dies, so does the other. This is all insanely vague, I know, but the important thing to understand about stands is that they are incredibly varied and diverse, making any generalization almost impossible due to all the exceptions and special cases that there are. However, One other crucial aspect that holds true for most of them is that they all have one or two, possibly more, very distinct and defined supernatural abilities. This can range from something normal, like being able to control fire, to more specific powers, like the ability to give life to inanimate objects or to steal people's souls, but only if they lose to you in a game of luck. These abilities can also be further categorized into various types, be it remote-controlled stands that work from a distance, automatic stands that work on themselves, hive stands that essentially work like a hive, like a collective, etc, etc, etc. One more thing we should clear up is how to actually obtain a stand, as it is one of the most convoluted and unclear aspects of this system. This is due to a number of reasons, mainly retconning, alternate universe shenanigans, and the fact that probably the largest and most important info dump about the major origin of stands is in part 5, Vento Aureo, which until recently only had notoriously bad scans and translations. So, to simplify and summarize, there are essentially two ways of obtaining a stand in the main Jojo timeline. The first one is quite simple. Be born with it. Or rather, be born with the potential of awakening a stand. The awakening then happens later in life through a trigger, usually stress. Simple? Yes. But perhaps unfortunately, this is the rarest origin of stands, with only a handful of characters in the series actually being born with theirs. The far more common method is to be pierced by what is called a stand arrow. Their origin was very weird and difficult to comprehend due to the aforementioned bad translations, but we fortunately now have a pretty clear picture of how this method came to be and how it works. Approximately 50,000 years ago, a meteorite fell to Earth in Cape York, Greenland. This meteorite contained an extraterrestrial virus that had seemingly no other function other than to eradicate all life it came into contact with. But, in an almost Darwinian twist, due to a quirk in evolution, some humans possess the potential to survive the exposure to that virus. Moreover, the survivors of the virus were granted supernatural abilities, stands. At some unknown point in history, a man described as wishing to acquire the power of the gods stole pieces of this meteorite and forged them into 6 arrows, later dubbed the stand arrows. Each of them contained the meteorite with the virus on its tip, with one bigger arrow, named the beetle arrow due to its design, containing a significantly higher dose of it, enabling an ability to evolve further. These arrows would subject anyone who got pierced by them to the virus, either killing them or, if they survived, granting them a stand ability. Additionally, a target who receives a stand would also find his blood relatives awakening their own powers as well. This is how most of the stand users in the series come to be, either by being pierced themselves or by awakening a stand thanks to a family member. These 6 arrows were found in an Egyptian tomb in 1986, and then promptly stolen by an Italian mafia boss to then be used and distributed. The arrows show a mysterious sign of conscience, sometimes actively seeking out those strong enough to survive them, and in one case even automatically piercing one of them. Now, there are other methods of obtaining stands in the alternate universe, but they mostly revolve around surviving an encounter with a specific location or coming into contact with the body of Jesus Christ. Yes, I am serious. So, did you get all that? No? Good, let's jam. Now, warning. This positive section is gonna be quite long, mostly because I think that stands are one of the best power systems ever created. And why do I think that? Well, I am glad you asked. Let's start with something rather small. Tying a power system to the user's psyche and soul is something many series attempt, but few actually follow through with that idea. One of them is Hiroyuki Araki, Jojo's author and creator. And the way he uses the concept is quite ingenious and subtle. And attribute you wouldn't assume fucking Jojo to display at first glance out of all things. Because stands are visible manifestations of a person's soul, psyche and mind, Araki can use both its power and design to enhance, subvert, or question certain characteristics of the user. This way, he can sneak in more info about the character in a subtle and well-integrated way that is only possible in a visual medium. If you want a very obvious example of this, take a look at Josuke Higashikata, the protagonist from Part 4, Diamond is Unbreakable. His power allows him to restore things back to the previous state, and, most importantly, has the ability to heal people. This, in a series that up to that point had mostly featured combat-oriented stands made to harm, clues us into the kinder, warmer person that Josuke is. Additionally, his power doesn't work on himself, meaning that if he gets injured, he cannot heal himself. He essentially has to be the healer of the party without having to rely on that himself. This means that his primary power necessitates selflessness and cooperation, which are very much aspects of his character that are not only central to both him and the themes of Part 4, but also serve to differentiate him from the more solo-op, battle-hardened Jotaro, the previous protagonist. This is only one example of many of how Araki uses the stand system to give many of his characters a lot more depth than they might have otherwise had. This goes as far as with the stand names, most of which are references to pop culture bands, albums, and hit songs. For example, the stand Black Sabbath reflects the lyrics of the song Black Sabbath in its ability, as the song tells of a dark figure rising from the shadow, and Black Sabbath, the stand, is a dark figure that travels through shadows. Its user Polpo, meanwhile, is given a scene where he eats two of his fingers without explanation within the series, which is a subtle nod to one of the members of the band Black Sabbath losing the tips of those exact fingers. It's obscure, it's small, you will barely notice, but it enriches the system and gives it layers upon layers of meaning, in some cases even implying and hinting at completely new aspects of a character. My favorite case, and arguably the most subtle and pointless one, is the design of Dio's stand, the world. The choice to depict his psyche as a man wearing scuba gear is interesting to me, considering that Dio, prior to awakening his stand, had spent 100 years trapped at the bottom of the ocean. So this almost insignificant detail implies a great deal of things. Hydrophobia? The desire to never be submerged again? A trauma from the experience, perhaps? Or is it just a dumb Easter egg and I'm just an anituber trying way too hard? It's uncertain, tiny, and never a focus, but the fact that it opens up all these possible interpretations and meanings makes the process of observing and experiencing stands an incredibly rewarding one. If these kind of details and analysis interest you further, the YouTube channel Medi Not the Bad Guy has multiple videos going over many different characters and their stands, with an insane and admirable eye for detail and interpretation. He is really knowledgeable on the series in general, and if you're at all interested in this sort of stuff and in JoJo's, do check him out. I'll link his channel in the description. But while all this extra characterization is really good, JoJo is still a battle shonen, and therefore, one big criteria in evaluating its power system is to look at if and how it enables the author to write interesting and satisfying combat and action. Luckily, Araki gotcha. In his video on Part 3, YouTuber Super Eyepatch Wolf presents the idea that, while most combat scenarios are made up of 3 steps, engagement, struggle, and resolution, stands add an additional layer to it, the mystery, which is a model I particularly like and would like to use for this video as well. Essentially, the fact that stands can be possessed by anyone and can take any form and have any ability makes figuring out who your enemy even is and what he can do a core part of the fight. Many fights even go as far as to establish early on that the moment one side figures out the identity and power of the other, the fight is over, like in Zucchero's fight against Bruno and his gang in part 5. Essentially, figuring out who your enemy is becomes an integral part of winning. However, this aspect only comes together if we add the crucial final piece to the puzzle: the abilities themselves. The structure stands allow is already a great foundation, but if the actual powers the users are granted were boring and unfit for such a structure, the system would ultimately fail. But again, Araki excels with seeming ease. If I had to pin down what makes stands so interesting, I think it's the unorthodox, incredibly specific, and creative powers most of them have. While some of the early stands, especially in early part 3, tend to be rather basic, past that point, many stands are given incredibly unique and diverse powers. But even more than that, many of them have abilities that are not primarily suited for combat. For example, meet Leone Abbacchio, member of part 5's main cast and ex-cop turned mafioso. As a muscular, imposing man, and canonically the physically strongest character in the group, one would expect his power to reflect that and be a dangerous, combat-focused stand. But no. His stand, Moody Blues, only has one major ability, that being looking into the past events by replaying them as a specific person in a specific location. This feeds back into Abbacchio as a character, as he is a man bound by his past, given the ironic power to eternally replay it. But it also completely changes his role in combat. Whereas in other shows, the tough-ass cop would be very much involved in most fights, Abbacchio's power necessitates him to stay back, since he is the gang's key method of finding and solving mysteries. And if he enters the fray, his stand forces him to get creative in order to make the most out of it. Or, for an even more extreme example, the best fight in part 3 doesn't even feature a single punch, just the most tense and exhilarating round of poker you have ever seen, against an opponent who steals your souls, but only if you lose. Therefore, we enter the realm of mindfuckery and bluffs. This is also emblematic of another strength of stand battles, which is a direct result of the previous 2 points. A stand battle will almost always require an insane amount of mind games to win, which is due to both the mystery of the user and ability and the often insanely specific and weird nature of that ability. This means that every battle has enormous potential to be and remain engaging, as the combatants go back and forth in a I know that you know but you know that I know manner. This shifts the focus of fights away from the usually found physical warfare into the often way more interesting territory of information warfare, where combatants have to think and deduce both their opponent's ability and strategy, and figure out their own possible ways of fighting and conquering those abilities with the possibilities and powers that they themselves have at hand. This gives most fights an almost puzzle-like property, where the viewer/reader can think along to try and guess how it's gonna play out, which in turn makes most combat encounters insanely satisfying to experience. Lastly, another more minor point is how stand abilities can be used to play into the themes of a given story arc or part. I already mentioned how Abbacchio's and Josuke's stands work in tandem with their characters, and this same connection can be drawn between some of the more major stands in the part and that part's central themes. I will just quickly present my favorite example before we move on to the next section. After Abbacchio gets donutted, he meets his ex-police partner in the afterlife, trying to complete a menial and almost pointless task, collecting broken bottle shards in search for fingerprints of a criminal. To Abbacchio asking why he would bother with that, this exchange happens. What are you gonna do if you don't find anything? You might not get any fingerprints. No, even if you do, the perp could hire a good lawyer and get declared not guilty. What drives you to keep toiling despite that? The result is not all I desire. When you desire only the result, you start trying to take shortcuts. And when you start taking shortcuts, you might lose sight of the truth. Eventually, you lose your motivation, too. I believe that the will to seek out the truth is what's important. As long as you have the will to seek it out, then even if the perp gets away this time, you'll reach your destination eventually, won't you? That's because you're seeking it out, don't you agree? If you have read part 5, you can draw your own conclusions on why this is relevant. For the others, read part 5. It is small, but it adds a layer of thematic consistency to the story, and makes it all feel great and connected. Fighting But of course, all power systems have their shortcomings, and stands are no exception. However, what could be the issue here? They facilitate the writing of interesting combat, give insight into most characters, and strengthen the themes of the story. So, what could be amiss? Well, ironically, the source of the problem is also the source of the greatness of this system. Hirohiko Araki himself. That is to say, his writing style. Now, I would never suggest that Araki is bad at writing. In fact, I think he's quite fantastic overall. However, over the years, his style has been quite inconsistent. He tends to completely switch gears multiple times, introducing things out of nowhere and omitting things without explanation. And while the Araki forgets meme is mostly trash, it is at times hard to justify why and how certain things play out the way they do. And while this erratic and unpredictable style absolutely adds to the bizarre nature of the series, it can make some aspects feel unfulfilling, inconsistent, or downright stupid. And out of all the parts that suffer from this, I think stands are the most noticeable one. Example: Giorno's life shot ability allows him to essentially incapacitate an enemy in one hit by making their mind go berserk. Super useful and powerful, right? Yes. Could have been used for later fights, right? Yes. Is it ever used again after its introduction? No. Also, Star Platinum can punch things, except it can also suck things really hard, but it also extends its fingers like a gun, but it only does it once because of reasons. It makes no sense, comes out of nowhere, and when battles are won with twists like these, it just makes it all feel pointless and unsatisfying to watch. It betrays your expectations and your knowledge of the systems, and makes predicting and thinking about these fights just kind of unsatisfying. And while this isn't a huge problem, and it doesn't happen all that much, when it happens, it's a real shame. Because this means there are essentially two possible feelings a viewer/reader can have following the final twist of a stand battle. It's either, oh my god, that was really clever and cool, wow! Or, okay, I fucking guess. If you fucking say so, Araki, fuck you! And while the former is way more common, the latter can really suck the enjoyment out of a scene. Also, Requiem stands. Because fucking what? In conclusion, stands are a fantastic power system. They allow Araki to simultaneously make battles interesting and engaging, give his characters layers of added depth, and even enhance the central themes of the story he wants to tell. If you just consider the system in isolation, it is one of the strongest and most well-conceived power systems in manga. Araki's creativity, added with his encyclopedic knowledge of pop culture, makes stands insanely fun to discover, experience, and break down. Their only downfall is the sometimes quirky and unpredictable nature of their creator, but when the system works, it really works well. One could even say, it just works.